The yard had been quiet all morning, the kind of quiet that comes when autumn has finished its business and the ground has hardened, but the first snow has not yet committed to staying. Ned Stark stood at the edge of the practice ground with his arms folded across his chest, his breath making pale clouds above the collar of his cloak, watching the boys work. They were not his two boys. One of them was not his boy at all. But he had stopped thinking of it in those terms years ago, because stopping was the only way to remain functional. Jon came in low, driving from the hips, and Robb twisted left and caught him across the shoulder with the flat of his practice blade. A clean hit. Jon took it without a sound, rolled with the momentum, came back to his feet faster than seemed possible. 15 years old, and he moved like water, finding the quickest path through stone, all efficiency, no surplus. He reset his guard and waited, dark hair damp at the temples, grey eyes steady and measuring, giving nothing away. Robb laughed. Robb always laughed when he fought, not from cruelty, but from a surplus of gladness that had to go somewhere. And the yard was as good as any. He was broader across the shoulders than Jon, taller by 2 fingers if that, and the auburn hair his mother had given him caught the thin autumn light in a way that made him look precisely like what the realm expected a lord's heir to look like. North and river water assembled in the right proportions, everything in its proper place. Jon didn't look like that. Jon looked like... Ned stopped the thought before it completed. He had long since learned where the edge of it was. The truth was that they were nearly the same height and the same weight within a stone, equally matched in the yard in any fair accounting. The difference lived in something harder to measure. Robb fought as though the yard were his, because it was, and he knew it. Jon fought as though he were a visitor, not a lesser one, not an unwelcome one, but a visitor nonetheless. There was a conserving of motion in him, a precision that came from 15 years of understanding that nothing in this life was freely given to someone who held his particular place at this particular table. Ned watched Jon feint, right and step left, and slip underneath Robb's guard. Robb swore with some feeling, and they broke apart, both grinning now. The boy is good, Ned thought. He could have been extraordinary, given a different story to live inside of. He stopped himself there. He always stopped himself there. The gates opened at mid-morning. Ned heard the horn from the corridor. One long, flat note, the signal for a small party coming in peace, and felt something shift below his sternum before he had consciously understood what it was. He walked to the yard without hurrying, which cost him something. The banner was grey-green, and the figure pressed into the lance cap was black. He had not seen that sigil in 15 years. He recognized it the way you recognize a scar, not with surprise, but with the precise memory of how it was made. Howland Reed was smaller than Ned remembered, or perhaps he had always been this small, and time had allowed Ned to revise the memory upward. Crannogmen were built to different specifications, compact, unhurried, with the careful stillness that came from living beside water that would swallow you if you stepped carelessly. He dismounted without theatre and handed his reins to the stable hand with the ease of a man who had ridden hard for 3 days and was not going to let anyone see it. Behind him, 2 young people came down from their horses. A girl of about 15, quick-eyed, with a net and short-handled spear slung at her hip in the manner of the neck. A boy of 12, slight and deliberate, who looked at Winterfell's walls with an expression that was not quite wonder and not quite familiarity. Something between the two, as though he recognized a place he had only ever seen in sleep. Ned walked across the yard to meet them. "Lord Reed." He gripped Howland's arm, and Howland gripped back, and there was a great deal that lived in that contact which neither of them would have known how to say plainly. Greywater Watch must be quiet if its lord can leave it. Greywater Watch is always quiet, Howland said. That is what the neck is for. He was smiling. The smile did not reach the part of his eyes that mattered. Ned could feel John somewhere behind him. He always knew where John was, had always known, the way you know where a wound is, even when you are not looking at it. He did not turn. He kept his face still, gripped Howland's arm once more in the manner of men who share something that cannot be spoken in a yard full of people, and walked him inside. They spoke alone in Ned's solar. Door closed, fire built up against a chill that had nothing to do with the season. "Robert is a fortnight out," Howland said. He had not sat. Neither had Ned. "Word reached the neck by Raven 3 days past. He rides north to name you his hand of the king." "I know. Then you will go south, and John will go with you." Ned said nothing. Howland set a leather satchel on the table between them. He opened it with the deliberate care of someone who had rehearsed this motion, not today but years ago, when the thing inside it was still fresh. Within the satchel was a single document sealed with dark wax, the lizard lion of House Reed pressed into it and aged now to the color of old blood. "I wrote this the same year you came home," he said. 283. "I have carried it since, and told no living soul what was in it." He did not pick it up. "I stood at the foot of those stairs, Ned. I heard what she said to you. I heard her give the boy his name." Ned looked at the letter without touching it. "I know what it says. I know you do. That is not the point." Howland's voice was quiet, without reproach, and somehow that made it worse than anger would have. "The point is that you are about to take him south, into the Red Keep, into a court where knowing things is the only commerce that matters, where there are people whose entire purpose is to find out what you are trying to hide." He stopped. "And you are going to do all of that while he still believes himself a bastard, with nothing ahead of him but the wall." In the yard below, the sounds had started up again. Boots on frozen ground, the ring of steel on steel. John and Rob, still at it. Neither of them knew he was in here. Neither of them knew what was sitting in this room. "He has not committed to anything," Ned said. "He will. He will commit to the wall because you have left him no other story to live in." Howland did not offer the letter. "He is not Jon Snow, Ned. He is Aegon Targaryen, true-born son of Rhaegar and your sister, born of a lawful marriage before the old gods. He deserves to know that. He deserves to know it before he is old enough to choose wrong paths for wrong reasons." The name sat in the room like something with weight. "If Robert knew," Ned began. "That is why I came before Robert arrives, not after." Howland met his eyes without flinching, without anger, which was somehow harder to face than anger would have been. "I am not leaving, Ned. I waited 15 years because the boy was young and you were too close to it, and the whole thing was too fragile. Those conditions no longer apply. So I am here, and I am asking you to tell him the truth." A silence. "Or to explain to me what truth is worse than what you have already done to him." The fire had burned lower while they spoke. Neither of them had noticed. Ned looked at the letter for a long time, at the old wax, at the pressed lizard lion, at the 15 years of weight that lived inside that seal. He thought about the tower. He thought about a road going north and a promise made to a dying woman and a boy who had grown up believing himself borrowed, temporary, without purchase in his own life. "Give me tonight," he said at last. Howland Reed said nothing. He did not agree, or forgive, or offer comfort. He simply stayed. And that, Ned thought, was the particular quality of Howland Reed that he had never been able to find in anyone else. He always knew when words were not the instrument. The fire burned lower. The winter outside the window continued its patient business of arriving, and the yard below was loud with two boys who did not know yet that everything was about to change. He led Howland to the Godswood after the candles had burned to stubs and the last servants had gone to their beds. The night was cold, the kind of cold that settles into stone and stays. Their breath moved ahead of them through the dark passages, past the lich yard, and through the iron gate into the grove. The Godswood at night was something different from the Godswood in daylight. Deeper, older, less interested in the affairs of people. The ancient trees stood like witnesses. Above them, the heart tree rose against the stars, its white bark almost luminous in the dark. Its carved face, watching the way carved faces had watched this ground for longer than the Starks had held it. Ned stopped before it. He had been coming to this tree since he was a boy. He had spoken to it for 15 years, spoken to her, if he was being honest, the same way a man speaks to a face carved in stone above a grave. He had always known that one day the speaking would have to change direction. "Here," he said. Howland sat across from him on the roots, and neither of them said anything for a time. The heart tree's carved eyes faced them without judgment. Red sap had tracked down from those eyes over the years, and dried in lines that looked, in poor light, like old weeping. "Tell me the way you would have told it to anyone else," Ned said at last. "I need to hear it said." Howland spoke plainly, in the manner of a man releasing something that had become part of the architecture of his body. "There were 7 of them when they rode into the Red Mountains of Dawn," he said. "He and Ned and 5 others, men who had ridden far, and who deserved to have their names said carefully," Howland told him, and Ned understood the thing being offered. He was saying, they were not nothing. They were not just a number. 7 men, then, riding toward a tower in the mountains that should have been empty. 3 knights of the King's Guard were standing outside it when they arrived, white cloaks, drawn swords, 3 of the finest blades in the realm, standing at the base of a tower in Dawn, at the end of a war their side had lost, guarding something they had not abandoned. Ned had asked why they were not at the Trident, why they had not been there to fight beside the prince. The one they called the Sword of the Morning had answered. He was holding a pale blade, not Valyrian steel, but pale as it, beautiful as it. And Ned would have known his name already. Ned had fought beside his brothers for years. But the name was not the thing that mattered. The answer was the thing that mattered. He said they were exactly where their duty required them to be, that there were things worth protecting that outweighed a prince already dead. They talked for a while, Howland said, because that is what honorable men do before they kill each other. You establish that there is no other way, so that the killing can be done without shame on either side. And then there was no other way. He paused here. Ned waited. The 5 others died, Howland said, and the 3 Kingsguard. The man with the pale blade was the last standing and the worst to put down, and it was Ned who met him, and Ned who was losing when Howland drove his knife into the man's back from behind. "I am not proud of it," Howland said. "I know. He was the finest swordsman I have ever seen, perhaps the finest I would ever see. And I put a knife in his back while Ned had his attention." He looked at the carved face of the heart tree rather than at Ned. "I would do it again. Every time, without hesitation. But I want you to know that I am not proud of it." Ned said nothing. There was nothing adequate to say to that. He had been there. He knew exactly what the ground had looked like afterward, and what the silence had sounded like, and what it cost to walk away from a field like that as one of only 2 men left standing. Then Howland told the part that came after. He had stayed at the foot of the stairs inside the Tower of Joy. He was bleeding from a wound in his side, not badly enough to stop him, but enough to know it was there. Above him, through the ceiling of the lower room, he could hear a woman's voice. Not crying for help, not frightened, a voice in the deep extremity of labor, which is a sound unlike any other sound a person makes. He stayed at the foot of the stairs. He heard Ned go up. He heard Ned's name spoken. Once, clearly Ned, in a voice that was young and worn thin with effort. He heard a baby begin to cry. Howland stopped speaking. He was looking at his own hands in his lap, at the root of the heart tree between his feet. "I stood at the threshold of that room for a moment," he said. "I did not go in. That was not mine to enter." A silence. But I heard her. Another silence, shorter. She said, "Aegon. His name is Aegon Targaryen." He spoke it slowly, the way something is spoken when it has been carried at the center of a chest for 15 years. She said it clearly. The way you say something when you understand, there will not be another opportunity to say it. The heart tree's face watched the dark between the trees. And then she said, "Promise me, Ned." A silence long enough to fill a room. And then she stopped. He reached into the satchel and took out the letter. He held it for a moment without offering it, the same way he had held it in the solar that afternoon, the old wax dark against his palm, the lizard lion blurred slightly at the edges from time and handling. Then he held it out. Ned took it. He did not open it. He already knew every word inside. He knew the account better than Howland did in the ways that mattered, because Ned had been in that room, had held the boy himself, had looked at Lyanna's face in the last minutes. It was her face. He had made the promise. He had carried the baby down those stairs wrapped in the only cloth there was. He turned the letter over in his hands. 15 years this had sat sealed in the neck, patient as peat. "I'm sorry," he said. He was not sure who he was speaking to. Howland, perhaps, or the tree, or the woman whose name he had not yet said tonight and was not certain he could manage. Then his knees went to the ground. It was not a decision. His body understood something his mind was still refusing to form, and his knees found the frozen dirt before he had chosen to kneel. He pressed one hand against the base of the heart tree, the white bark, rough and cold and old past counting, and said her name once, Lyanna. The godswood said nothing in return. Trees do not speak, but the faces carved into the white wood had been carved by hands older than men, and sometimes, in 15 years of kneeling here, Ned had believed they listened all the same. Howland gave him the silence. He sat on the root across the clearing and said nothing, and made his presence feel like company rather than witness. That had always been the particular gift of Howland Reed. He knew when words were not the instrument. When Ned stood, nothing had been agreed to. Nothing had been formally promised. The letter was in his hand, and the tower was still in the past, and John was somewhere in the castle above them, asleep in the room he had always slept in, planning his quiet erasure to the wall, still believing himself to be the shape of a man that a bastard's life had made him. "What do you want me to do?" Ned said. Howland looked at him across the roots of the heart tree, in the dark, with the carved face, watching both of them equally. "Tell him the truth," he said. "That is all I have ever come here for." Ned looked at the letter in his hand for a long time. He looked at the old seal, at the slight imperfections in the wax, at the 15 years that lived inside it, waiting for someone to let them out. He did not open it, but he did not put it down. Jon noticed the crannogman at breakfast. The man was seated at the far end of the high table, where visiting lords sat when they were not important enough to be given their own rooms above the yard. He was small, smaller than most men Jon had ever seen, though he carried himself with no apparent awareness of this, and his pale eyes were fixed on Jon with the unhurried patience of something watching from a tree line. He was not staring. He was simply looking, which was somehow worse, the deliberate quality of someone making an assessment they had every intention of completing. Jon looked away. The sensation of being watched did not leave. "Who is that?" he said quietly to Robb, who was reaching across him for the bread. "Which?" "Small one. End of the table." Robb glanced. "No idea," he said, and went back to his bread with the easy disinterest of someone for whom this morning was identical to every other morning. Jon looked back. The man was still watching. Not threatening. There was nothing threatening about it, but measuring, with the quality of a calculation being finished. He found the Winterfell Meister in the corridor afterward and asked. The Meister told him the man was Lord Howland Reed of Greywater Watch, a bannerman and an old companion of Lord Eddard's from the years of the war. "An old friend," the Meister said. Jon thanked him and walked back to his duties, carrying the feeling that old friend was the beginning of an answer, not the whole of it. Mira Reed found him in the practice yard just before midday. She had a net on one shoulder and a short spear in her left hand, and she walked across the frozen ground toward him, the way people from the neck walked everywhere, lightly, on the balls of her feet, as though she half expected the surface beneath her to shift. She was small like her father. She was 15, the same age as Jon. "You practice here every morning," she said. It was not a question. Most mornings. She looked at the practice swords racked against the wall, then at the spear in her own hand. "Not with those," she said, and before he had quite finished deciding what she meant, she came at him. The net was a narrow mesh throwing net, nothing like anything Jon had trained against, and when he stepped back and brought his guard up with the practice sword the way he had been taught, she had already gone low and swept his feet from under him with the butt of the spear before the net had finished wrapping around his sword arm. He hit the frozen ground hard enough to find a buried stone with his shoulder. She looked down at him with an expression he could not read. "We don't use swords much," she said. "In the neck." He untangled the net, got to his feet, and tried not to show that his shoulder was going to remind him of this moment for several days. "I can see that," he said. They practiced for the better part of an hour. He was better with a sword than she was, and worse in every other respect. She fought with a kind of economy he had never encountered. No motion wasted, no force applied where leverage would do the same work, no commitment to a line until the commitment was already complete. It was not the kind of fighting that looked impressive. It was the kind that worked, which was a different thing entirely. She looked at him the same way her father had looked at him at breakfast, with that patient, measuring stillness. He could not tell what the assessment was. Whatever she had come to, she was keeping it. "You're going to the wall," she said, when they stopped. "That was the plan," he said. She nodded once, as though he had confirmed something she had already known, picked up her net and her spear, and walked back across the yard without looking at him again. Jon stood where he was, his arm still aching from the net, watching her go, trying to name the thing that was bothering him, and finding that he could not. Bran had been climbing the broken tower since before he could remember being afraid of heights, which was to say, he had never been afraid of heights. It was the unfinished tower on the eastern side of the castle, the one that had been left incomplete for as long as anyone could tell him, which meant for as long as the castle had existed in its current form, and possibly longer. Bran liked it because it was unfinished. It gave you a view you could not get from anywhere the architects had intended you to stand. He was sitting at the highest point, legs hanging over the edge, watching the flat grey northern sky, when the boy from the neck climbed up behind him. The thin 12-year-old, the girl's brother, the one with the wide, dark eyes, who moved without making sounds. He sat beside Bran without being invited, and for a while they sat together in the wind without speaking. Below them Winterfell went about its mourning. The yard, the smoke from the kitchens, the distant percussion of the practice ground. "I dreamed about this castle," the boy said. Bran looked at him. "I dream things," he said. He was watching the horizon, north, where the sky met the hills in a line like a blade edge. "I dreamed about a wolf running in the dark, white as bone." A pause. "I dreamed about you, standing at a window very high up, looking down at something you could not look away from." "What was it?" Bran said. The boy was quiet for a long time. When he finally answered, he said, "I don't know yet, but I think you will." He climbed back down without announcing his departure, moving so carefully and quietly that Bran barely heard him go. The wind picked up. Bran stayed where he was, looking north at the grey sky, and thought about wolves and about windows, and about the particular feeling of looking down from a height so great that falling became a kind of temptation. The raven arrived at midday. Ned read the message twice in the rookery, then folded it carefully and held it against his palm for a moment before walking down. Robert's column. 2 days at most, possibly less. The full royal progress, not a reduced party. The entire court on the road, which meant Cersei, which meant Jaime, which meant all of the things that living in the Red Keep produced in people who had been there long enough. He went and found Howland. Howland was in the small room the steward had given him, standing at the window with his arms at his sides. Ned told him what the raven said. Howland listened without interrupting. "A day, then," Howland said. "Less, perhaps. What will you do with it?" Ned was quiet for a moment. Outside, the afternoon was going grey and cold, winter pressing its case with the patience of something that knew it would eventually win. He thought about the godswood last night, and the letter that was still on the table beside his bed, where he had set it before dawn, and had not been able to move since. "Not the great hall," he said. "Not with Cersei standing 3 feet away. Not in front of the court." He stopped, organized the words, started again. "But I'm going to tell him. When he comes, before he says anything about the hand, before any politics, before any of it, I will ask him to walk with me, the way we used to. Man to man, old friends." He stopped again. Robert loved her. That has always been true. It is the only path through this that doesn't end in blood. And I mean to ask that love to do the thing I have been too afraid to ask it to do for 15 years. Howland was quiet for a moment. "That is more than I expected from you today," he said. "Don't," Ned said, more sharply than he intended. Then, quieter. "Just don't." Howland did not. He turned back to the window, and they stood in the small room together without speaking, and the afternoon moved toward the day that would change everything. Jon was in the armory when the sun went down. He was running a whetstone along a blade that did not need it. He did this sometimes. The motion was useful without requiring thought, and it allowed him to be alone without appearing to be alone, which was a distinction that mattered to him more than he could have explained. He thought about the wall. He had been thinking about the wall for 2 years in the particular way you think about something already decided. Robb would have Winterfell. Robb was born to have Winterfell, and the castle knew it, and the men knew it, and Robb himself moved through his life with the easy confidence of someone standing on solid ground. Sansa would marry some lord their father chose, someone with a castle and a name and the right blood. Arya would do what Arya wanted, which would be wrong by every measure anyone applied to it, except the measure Arya herself used. And Jon was the bastard. That was the end of the accounting. The wall was not a punishment. It was simply the shape that the remaining space made. He ran the whetstone along the edge. The feeling that he couldn't name had been sitting in his chest since the morning the grey-green banner came through the gates. He could not locate it precisely. He could not trace it to any one thing that Howland Reed had said, or done, or not said. It was the watching, perhaps. The father's pale eyes at breakfast, the daughter's measuring quiet in the yard after she put him on his back with a net. The way both of them looked at him, as though they knew something about him that he did not. He set the whetstone down. The wall, he thought. The watch. The cold and the darkness, and a life that was at least honestly what it looked like. There was something to be said for that. He had always thought there was something to be said for that. He could not say, tonight, why the saying of it felt less convincing than it had yesterday. They heard the royal progress before they saw it, the distant percussion of a column on the road, the creak of wagons, the sound of several hundred people moving through a landscape that had not been asked if it wanted them. Ned stood in the yard with his household and waited. The king came through the gates on a horse that looked slightly unhappy about its situation, and Ned's first thought was that Robert had gotten larger. Not in the way of growing, in the way of things that expand to fill whatever space life opens around them. He was massive, bearded, dressed in gold and black, and his face carried the quality of a man who had stopped being surprised by his own unhappiness a long time ago. Then he saw Ned, and something in the face opened. He dismounted without help and crossed the yard and gripped Ned by both shoulders, and Ned could feel the old strength in those hands, the hands that had made a history on a riverbank 15 years ago. And then Robert pulled him into an embrace that was more honest than anything Ned had expected from this morning. "Ned," he said. Just that. "Your Grace." "Don't. Not before we've had a drink." He stepped back and looked at him. "You look like someone told you winter was coming, though I suppose you already knew." The laugh was large and brief. Then, quieter, without the laugh, "I want to see her." Behind him, the progress filed into the yard. The Queen, tall and golden-haired in red and gold, her eyes moving over the assembled household with the systematic patience of a woman who catalogued everything. Beside her, Sir Jaime in white, carrying himself with the effortless ease of the finest sword in any room. The boy, Joffrey, 12, with Lannister gold on his head and Lannister green in his eyes, and nothing of Robert anywhere visible. A dwarf at the edge of the company, watching everything from slightly to the side of the centre, with the alert gaze of a man who had decided long ago that the best information was gathered from the margins. Ned led the king down to the crypts. The crypts were cold in the specific way of underground places, and the particular way of tombs, a stillness that did not participate in seasons or in time. Ned brought the torch and walked Robert past the row of stone kings on their thrones with their iron swords, the lords and kings of winter who kept their vigil in the dark below the castle until they reached the place where the stone was newer than the rest. Robert stopped. The carver had given her the stark look. Strong bones, the dark hair carved in waves around the shoulders, a directness to the face that had not been softened. At the base of the statue, worked into the stone as though the carver had always known it was necessary. A garland of winter roses lay against the plinth. Robert stood before it for a long time. He did not move. He did not speak. He was, Ned thought, a man paying a debt he had been carrying for 15 years to a creditor who was no longer present to receive it. Then he said her name, very quietly, in a voice that had nothing of kingship in it, the stripped-down voice of a man speaking to someone who mattered before he was a king. Just her name, just once, as though saying it in the dark would find her somehow. Ned watched from the doorway and said nothing. There was nothing to say. The feast had the surface quality of celebration, and Ned sat through it, performing his role as host, while the thing he had decided sat in his chest like a stone waiting to be moved. Tyrion had positioned himself near the younger Stark girls, Sansa at 12, watching him with the polite amusement of someone who had been told to find him funny, and had instead found him actually funny, Arya at 9, laughing without the polite qualification at whatever he was saying. Robb was across from Joffrey, whose method of ignoring Robb was the particular method of someone who wanted the ignoring observed. Jon sat near the far end of the table from the guests, eating without appetite, looking at no one, carrying that specific stillness of his that was not peace. Cersei was watching Howland read. Ned noticed it in the second hour of the feast, when the wine had warmed the room and the household was easier, and she was the one person in the hall who had not loosened by a single degree. Her eyes moved through the company with the patience of a woman cataloguing what she didn't understand, and Howland, who had seated himself among the lesser guests, not seeking position, not seeking Ned's eye, had drawn her attention precisely because he sought nothing. In rooms full of people competing for proximity to power, the one person not competing was the most interesting thing in the room. She leaned toward Jaime during a movement of the feast that disguised the conversation. Jaime glanced toward the far table. He said something. She studied Howland for another moment, and then turned back to the feast, and Ned watched her set the question in whatever part of herself she kept things that needed answers, and put a smile over it. After the feast, Ned fell into step beside Robert in the corridor as the household dispersed. "Walk with me," he said, "before anything else is said between us. Before you name me your hand, before politics, before any of it, come with me tonight." Robert looked at him with the eyes of someone who had known him for 20 years and was not certain what he was looking at tonight. Then he shrugged, in the way of a man who had run out of reasons to say no. "Lead on," he said. They went to the God's Wood by torchlight and sat beside the heart tree. Ned told him plainly. He had decided, walking through the dark corridors, that there was no version of this that was gentle, and that attempting gentleness would be a form of disrespect to both of them. He began with the tower. He told Robert that the war had been built on a truth and something that was not the truth, that Rhaegar had not taken Lyanna by force, that she had gone with him and had gone willingly, and that there was a distinction there that the years had buried but had not made untrue. He told him about the marriage, a weirwood heart tree in the mountains of Dorne. Rhaegar had annulled his first marriage before a high septon, and then wed Lyanna before the old gods, a ceremony witnessed, made lawful, made real. She was not his captive. She was his wife. He told him that Lyanna had died in that tower bearing Rhaegar's son. He told him the son was Jon. The torchlight moved in the slight, cold wind off the trees. Robert had not spoken. His face had gone through several things in sequence. Shock first, then something behind shock that was harder to name. Then something that was not anger, but was in the same country as anger. And then something that was worse than either. Then Robert stood. He walked 3 paces toward the heart tree. He stopped. He raised his fist and pressed it against the white bark. Not the blow that had broken things at the trident, but the opposite motion, the one that stops itself. His knuckles went white. His breath came out in a long, uneven exhaust that was not quite a sound. Then he wept. Ned had expected anger. He had braced for it, the eruption, the roar, the hand reaching for a sword that was not at his hip. What he had not prepared for was this. Robert's shoulders went wrong, the way broad shoulders go wrong when a large man is fighting something he cannot fight, and he wept for Lyanna Stark, and it was the worst thing Ned had ever watched, because it was not the grief of a man who had lost something to another man. It was the grief of a man who understood, for the first time, that there had been nothing to lose. She had not needed saving. She had not been taken. She had chosen, with her whole self, to go. She had chosen Rhaegar, and she had loved him, and she had died carrying his child, and nothing Robert had done, not the war, not the killing, not the taking of the throne, had addressed the actual situation in any way at all. It passed. Eventually it passed. Robert lowered his fist from the bark and wiped his face with the back of his hand and turned. He looked like a man who had put something down after carrying it for 15 years and found that the setting down was worse than the carrying. "Does he know?" he said. "No." "What proof have you?" "Howland read. He was there at the foot of the stairs when Lyanna named the boy. He has kept a written account, sealed since the year of his birth." A pause. "And my word." "Your word," Robert said. The ghost of something moved through his expression. "Yes, your word." He was quiet for a moment. "Will you swear it? Before the gods?" "I swore it 15 years ago," Ned said. "To her, when she was dying. She asked me to keep the boy alive. I have kept that oath in the only way I knew." He looked at the heart tree. "I am not certain it still requires what it once required of me." Robert looked at him for a long time. Then he said, "Go to bed, Ned." His voice was not unkind. "I need to think." Ned left him there. When he looked back from the gate of the Godswood, Robert was still standing before the heart tree, with his hand against the bark and his head bowed, and the torchlight was small and warm in all that dark, and the carved face watched the king the way it had watched every king and every grief that had ever stood beneath it. Robert had not slept. He stood at the parapet in the first grey light of morning, looking out at the darkness that was becoming the landscape, and thought about a boy with dark hair. Not his own bastards. He had stopped keeping count of those years ago. This boy, the 15-year-old he had broken bread with at the feast last night, who apparently carried a name older and heavier than Jon Snow, a name that sat in Robert's chest like a coal he couldn't decide whether to blow on or smother. Lyanna had gone with Rhaegar. Not taken. Gone. Had loved him, or done something close enough to love that the distinction barely mattered now. Had married him in a weirwood grove in Dawn, and died bearing his child, and given the child to her brother to carry north. And the child had grown up in front of Robert for 15 years, on every visit Robert had made to Winterfell, and Robert had never... He stopped that thought. The rage at Rhaegar was still there. It would always be there. It had been part of his architecture since the Ruby Ford, and it would be part of it when he died. But Rhaegar was dead, and Lyanna was dead, and everything he had done in their names was done, and what he felt on the battlements in the grey morning was mostly that he was very tired, and that the boy was alive, and that the boy was the last piece of her in the world. He did not know yet what he was going to do with any of it. Cersei had placed a servant near the Godswood gate. Not obtrusively, A laundress with legitimate reason to be in that passage. A woman who had come to understand that the interests of House Lannister were her interests too. The laundress reported in the small hours. Lord Eddard had led the king to the heart tree after the feast, well past midnight. The king had struck the tree with his fist at some point. Both men had stayed until nearly dawn. Cersei sat with this in her chambers while her ladies slept and worked out the shape of it. Something had been said. Something significant. The king did not spend hours in a godswood in the northern dark because the conversation was trivial, and he did not strike a sacred tree because he had received good news. She dressed in the early morning and went to find Jaime herself. He was in the corridor near the king's rooms, awake, in his white cloak. He had been awake for a while, she could tell. "The Crannog man," she said. "I heard," he said. He had. "Find out what Ned Stark said to him last night." Jaime looked at her. "He'll have said nothing useful. Ned Stark doesn't say useful things to people who are looking for them." "Then find out what he didn't say." She left him there. Ned was in the armory when Jaime found him. The smell of iron and oil was a form of order this morning had no other form of, and Ned had come here because his hands needed something to do, and because a man who was running a whetstone along an already sharp blade looked busy enough that people would leave him to it. He was doing exactly that when Jaime appeared in the doorway in his white cloak, carrying himself with the ease of someone who had come to inspect weapons and had something else in mind entirely. "Sleep well," Jaime said. "Adequately," Ned said. "The king was on the battlements at dawn, doesn't usually do that." He was thinking. About what, do you suppose? Ned looked at him. Jaime had moved to the rack of swords and was turning one in his hand with the absent expertise of someone for whom steel was vocabulary, and there was in the studied quality of his attention to the blade the specific care of a man being careful. Ned thought about what Jaime carried beyond the white cloak, the brotherhood of it, the years of it, the 3 white cloaks who had stood at the base of a tower in dawn and never come home. Jaime had known those men. He had been a brother of that order before any of them rode south. He knew what had happened there, or at least he knew what had not come back from it. Robert had information, Ned said carefully, that he needed time to process. Jaime set the sword back on its peg. "About the bastard," he said. Not quite a question, not quite a statement. The voice of someone arriving at a destination they had been circling for a long time. "I didn't say that." "No." Jaime looked at him at last. His face was doing the work of staying still. "I've thought about it. On and off. The timing. A boy born in the final weeks of the rebellion, the same year Robert took the throne. And Ned Stark has never once said the mother's name." He paused. "I chose not to think about it too hard. Some things are easier held at distance." He paused again. "The answer is larger than I wanted it to be." Ned said nothing. Jaime seemed to accept the silence as what it was. Something moved through his expression. Not surprise, not quite grief, but something that lived near both of them. Something that had to do with towers and white cloaks and the cost of knowing things. Then he said, "Right," in a quiet voice, and left. Ned stood alone in the armory for a moment, listening to his footsteps recede, and then went back to the blade. Tyrion found Howland Reed in the library before midday. He had been drawn there by the sight of a Crannog man at the shelves, which was the kind of thing that Tyrion had learned over a lifetime of following interesting things to follow. Howland was seated near the window with a book open in front of him. Tyrion pulled the chair across the table without invitation and sat. Howland did not look up. After a moment, Tyrion tilted his head to read the spine. A history of the Targaryen dynasty, written during the reign of the old conciliator king, illustrated. Not light reading, not coincidental reading. An unusual book for an unusual visitor, Tyrion said. Howland closed it without hurry or embarrassment. I like to read, he said. Most crannogmen who like to read don't ride all the way to Winterfell to do it. There are perfectly serviceable marshes. Tyrion settled back. You arrived before us. You came specifically, not incidentally. You have seated yourself at every meal, at the end of the table furthest from any concentration of power, which is itself a kind of positioning. He let a pause sit. You are reading about Targaryens. Howland Reed looked at him with those pale, still eyes. He said nothing. I am assembling something, Tyrion said. I haven't finished. I thought you should know someone was assembling it. Howland considered this for a moment, the way a man considers whether a question deserves an answer or whether the question is itself the answer. Then he said, You're your father's son in some ways. I am generally considered the family embarrassment, Tyrion said, which is often the most useful thing to be. He looked at the closed book on the table. Shall I tell you what I have so far? You'll tell me when you're ready, Howland said pleasantly, and opened the book again. Tyrion sat with him in the library while the morning moved toward afternoon, and the shape of what he was assembling became, slowly, more complete. They walked the north battlements in the afternoon, Jon and Meera, because Jon had offered, and because the north wall gave the best view of what winter was doing to the surrounding country. From the parapet, you could see past the stripped trees to where the land changed character, softening, widening, becoming the kind of ground that gave nothing away. The neck must look nothing like this, Jon said. It doesn't look like anything else in Westeros. Meera was leaning on the stone with her arms folded, looking north with the proprietorial ease of someone describing home. It swallows armies, hides them, forgets them. Roads that appear solid and aren't. Paths that look impassable and open if you know them. She paused. Nothing that has ever tried to march north through the neck has come out the other side the same size it went in. There's a castle at the causeway, Jon said. Moat Cailin. Moat Cailin holds the one road. The neck has 100 ways that aren't roads. My father knows every one of them. She looked at him. It is very difficult to find someone in the neck who does not want to be found, and very easy to keep someone safe there. Jon was quiet for a moment. Are you trying to tell me something? My father is, she said. The wind moved along the parapet between them. Jon looked north at the landscape that was hardening itself for winter, and thought about a castle that moved, and a Crannog man with measuring eyes, and a girl who had put him on his back in the yard and said nothing about it afterward. He thought about the 3 days since the Reed party arrived, and the way the air in Winterfell had changed, and the way his father had looked at him across the dinner table this morning, the careful look, the one that had something behind it, that had always been there, but had never been quite this close to the surface. When is he going to tell me? Jon said. Meera said nothing, which was, Jon had come to understand, a kind of answer. Ned came to find him in the late afternoon, and said only, Come with me to the Godswood, alone, before supper. Jon knew the voice, not the Lord's voice or the Father's voice, but the specific one Ned Stark used when the thing being said was not the thing that needed saying, and the actual thing was very heavy. He had heard it perhaps 4 times in his life, and each time it had marked something that did not unmarked itself. He set down what he was doing and followed. They sat beside the heart tree without ceremony, The godswood in late afternoon was grey and cold, the light coming through the bare branches at a flattening angle, the carved face of the heart tree, watching them with the same expression it had worn for longer than the family had stood on this ground. Ned did not begin with what John expected. He began with a woman named Lyanna. She was Ned's younger sister, he said. She was not much like Ned in the ways people used to measure such things, not careful or contained, not inclined to navigate around the edges of things when going straight through them was available. She had what the Starks carried in their blood in its most undiluted form, a refusal to be arranged by other people's expectations, a quality of life in her that made rooms feel different when she walked into them. She rode better than any of her brothers. She wept when she found things unjust and laughed at things that frightened other people. She loved without calculation and said what she thought without the usual apologies. And she had dark hair, Ned said, dark hair and grey, stark eyes, the grey of rivers in winter. And she looked, he said, very much like Arya. John went still. He sat on the root of the heart tree and went still the way the Starks went still. Not calm, not peace, but the management of something large in a finite space. And he listened. She died the year you were born, Ned said, in a tower in the mountains of Dawn. I was there. I was there when she died, and she asked me to make a promise. John's hands were resting on his knees. He did not move them. She gave you a name, Ned said, not Jon Snow. That was mine. That was the name I gave you to keep you alive. Her name for you was Aegon Targaryen. She was the lawful wife of Rhaegar Targaryen, the crown prince of the Seven Kingdoms, married to him in a proper ceremony before a weirwood heart tree in Dawn, with the old gods as witnesses. She was not taken. She chose to go. She loved him. And you are their son, born in lawful wedlock, with a name that has more claim on the Iron Throne than any living Baratheon. The godswood was completely quiet. You're lying, Jon said. I am not. You are. He stopped. He stood. He sat again, because his legs had made a unilateral decision and reversed it. He looked at Ned, and his face was still in that stark way, banked, controlled, not peaceful. But there was behind the grey eyes something cold and furious that was not going anywhere soon. 15 years, he said. Yes. You let me spend 15 years believing I was a bastard. Let me plan for the wall. Let Catelyn despise me. He stopped. The rage was quiet in the way that very cold things are quiet. What kind of love is that? What kind of father does that to? The kind that keeps you breathing. Jon went silent. Ned's voice was steady. Not comfortable, not easy, but steady in the way of someone who had lived a long time with a hard thing and had found that steadiness was the only way to carry it. When the war ended, Robert had already given the order. In King's Landing, during the sack, his own allies carried it out. Rhaegar's children were killed. His daughter Rhaenys, his infant son, also named Aegon. Children, Jon. They were killed because a true-born Targaryen heir is a sword pointed at everything Robert built, and Robert understood that, and the order was given. He stopped. If anyone in the world had known you existed, had known that a third child of Rhaegar survived, born of a lawful marriage, with a better claim on the throne than Robert's line, you would have died the same way. Whatever love Robert carried for your mother, his survival required your death. He looked at the heart tree rather than at Jon. A bastard of Ned Stark's is nothing. A true-born Targaryen prince is everything. Jon's hands were gripped together in his lap. He did not trust them separately. So I gave you my name, Ned said. I gave you my name, and I kept my mouth shut for 15 years. and I knew every day what it was costing you. I knew, and I kept doing it, because the only other choice was your grave before your first birthday." Silence. The light through the branches was going. Ned reached inside his cloak and placed a letter in Jon's hands. Old wax, a lizard lion seal, the particular weight of something that had been carried a long time. "Howland Reed was there," Ned said. "He stood at the foot of those stairs when Lyanna named you. He has kept this account sealed since the night of your birth, and he has told no living soul until this week. That is his sworn witness, signed and sealed. And I will stand before any lord in the realm and swear on my life that every word of it is true." Jon looked at the letter. He did not open it. He looked instead at the heart tree, which looked back. The carved face had seen a great many certainties arrive and rearrange themselves. It did not appear to find this one remarkable. He had grey eyes. He had checked, as a child, in reflective water. He had heard the songs about Targaryen violet, and he had looked and found grey. Storm grey. The grey of the north. His hair was dark, not silver. He looked like a Stark. He had always looked like a Stark, and been called a bastard Stark, and been treated as a borrowed, temporary Stark who ought to be grateful for the table he sat at. He looked like someone who had never quite arrived at the face he was supposed to have. He understood now that the face he was supposed to have was this one. That was somehow the part that was hardest to hold. He handed the letter back. "Does Robert know?" he said. "I told him the night he arrived." "What is he going to do?" "I don't know yet." Jon nodded once, the nod of a man receiving an answer he expected and had needed to hear anyway in order to locate where it sat. He looked at the heart tree for a moment longer. Then he stood up and put his hands at his sides and breathed. "I am still going to the wall," he said. Ned looked at him. "No," he said. "You are not." Jon did not argue. He did not agree. He stood there in the cold godswood with the carved face, watching him and his father watching him, and 15 years of the wrong story settling into a new shape around him, and he did not know yet what shape that was going to be when it finished, and neither did Ned, and the godswood did not offer any information on the subject. He walked back to the castle alone. In the day between Ned's conversation in the godswood and Robert's summons to the hall, Robert watched the boy. He was not subtle about it. He had never been particularly subtle, and on matters this close to the center of things, he found subtlety less useful than directness. Jon saw him watching. The grey eyes caught it each time with a brief flicker of awareness. The learned protocol of someone who had been looked at strangely his whole life, and each time said nothing and continued whatever he was doing. Robert watched him in the practice yard, where Jon worked against a training partner with an economy of motion that had nothing to do with sport and everything to do with someone who had never had the luxury of treating combat as entertainment. He watched him at the stables, where the boy spoke quietly to the horses, without performing anything for the man observing from across the yard. He watched him at the evening meal, and again in the corridors, these accidental encounters that were not entirely accidental. He was nothing like Rhaegar. Nothing in the colouring, nothing in the manner, nothing in the way he held himself or moved through a room. He looked like a Stark, the dark hair, the grey eyes, that were direct in a way that bordered on uncomfortable, and what he specifically looked like, Robert acknowledged at the end of the day with his cup and the dying fire, was Lyanna. Not the exact face. Something behind the face. The quality of inhabiting oneself without apology. The sense of a person who had decided, somewhere early, that they were what they were and would proceed accordingly, and that other people's arrangements for them were a secondary concern. He sent his request to Ned the following morning. Cersei had spent that same day assembling pieces. She had the gods would report from her laundress, Ned, Robert, the heart tree, nearly until dawn. She had the timing of Reed's arrival, before the court, not with it. She had Jaime, who had served with the men who died at the Tower of Joy, who knew the roster of the dead, and who confirmed, reluctantly, in the way he had become reluctant about certain things, that Howland Reed had been one of 2 men who came back from that tower. The other was Ned Stark. She set these pieces beside each other, and the shape they made was not ambiguous. She found Jaime in the corridor, outside the king's rooms that evening. "The Crannog man came to say the bastard is not a bastard," she said, without preamble. "They have told Robert, or are about to. We have to move before he does something that cannot be undone." Jaime's expression didn't change in the way of someone who is very carefully not changing their expression. "He is 15, he said. "He is a true-born Targaryen heir, if the account holds, and 15 does not stay 15. A 15-year-old with a Crannog man's letter is not a present threat to Joffrey." His voice was level, controlled. "Robert hasn't declared anything. He's watching the boy and thinking. Nothing has been formalized. A whisper from a man who lives in a swamp." "Joffrey's throne is only Joffrey's if it stays that way," she said. She watched him. He was doing the internal work again. The weighing she could see but not access. The thing that had been different in him since the king he had killed in the throne room of the Red Keep 15 years ago. He thought about what it meant when Targaryens were hunted. He had been there for the doing of it, and he carried it in a way she could not altogether predict. "I'll think about what can be done," he said. It was not the answer she wanted, but it was the answer she had. She let him go, and went to think about what she could do without him. Robert called the gathering for the following morning. He chose the great hall, not the architecture of formal judgment, but the architecture of household, the long tables and the fire, and the northern lords arranged along the benches with the focused attention of men who understood they had been summoned to witness something. Ned stood near the high table. Robb was in the hall, having been told to stand with the witnesses, and he had positioned himself beside Jon at the back, with the quiet, settled quality of someone who had decided his position and was not going to be moved from it. Jon stood with his hands at his sides and his face closed in the way Starks close their faces. Not hostile, not frightened, simply shut, the way shutters are shut before a storm arrives. Whatever it cost him to stand in a hall full of people who did not yet know what he already knew, he was not showing the cost. Grey eyes, dark hair, a back as straight as a castle wall. Nothing in his face invited reading. Robert stood at the high table. "Lord Howland Reed of Greywater Watch has come before me with information," he said. His battlefield voice, trained in the open air over many years, filled the stone hall without effort. "He has asked to speak. I have asked him to speak here, before witnesses. That is all this is." He sat down, folded his hands on the table, and looked at Howland. "Lord Reed." Howland rose. He told it in the neck way. No wasted motion, no gesture toward drama, no more words than the thing required. He had ridden to a tower in the mountains of Dawn 15 years ago as one of 7 men. He and Ned Stark were the only men who rode back out. He had stood at the foot of a staircase inside that tower and listened, while above him a woman neared the end of her life, and he had heard her name, the child she was leaving in the world behind her. The name she gave the child was Aegon Targaryen. She had described, in those last moments, the marriage, the weirwood ceremony in Dawn, the annulment of Rhaegar's first marriage, contracted before a high septon, the union that made the child legitimate before the old gods. Howland had written all of it that same night, and sealed it, and carried it for 15 years, and told it to no living soul until this week. "I tell it now," he said, "because the boy deserves to know his own name before the world makes further decisions on his behalf, and because the realm has been carrying a truth it was told was something else." He set the sealed letter on the high table and sat down. The hall was quiet, not the comfortable quiet of a room between conversations, the held breath quiet of a room waiting to understand what it had just heard. Ned stood. He confirmed every word. He did it without softening and without elaboration. He named the tower. He named what Lyanna had said. He said that the boy standing at the back of the hall was his sister's son, born of a lawful marriage, and that he would swear it before any gods the king named. He had kept this secret for 15 years. He was not keeping it any longer. His voice did not break. The lords along the benches were very still. They were northerners, which meant they had long memories and a complicated relationship with the families that had ruled them for generations, and what they were hearing had implications that none of them had had any preparation for. Robert waited until the hall had processed what Ned had said. He was watching the table rather than the room, and then he looked up. "The boy is Lyanna's son," he said. Simple, direct, the voice he used when he had made his decision and wanted the decision heard clearly. "I knew Lyanna Stark. She would not have given Ned this charge at the cost of her life if the charge were a lie. That is sufficient for me to take the matter seriously." A pause. "There are written records in Old Town. The Citadel holds the records of the faith, including those of Septon Maynard, who administered the relevant ceremonies. I will send for them. Until they are examined, I make no formal declaration of succession or inheritance." He looked at the sealed letter on the table, then at the hall. "But I have heard what I have heard. The matter is before me." He said nothing else. The lords began to breathe again, carefully, the way men breathe when the ground they are standing on has just announced that it is different ground than they thought. John, at the back of the hall, didn't move. Rob's shoulder was an inch from his. That was the only thing in the room that felt, to John, like solid footing. Cersei stood in the gallery above the hall. She had come in before the testimonies began and listened from the shadows at the rail, and she had heard every word that Howland Reed said, and every word that Ned said, and every word that Robert said, and she had watched the boy at the back of the hall and made her accounting. Old Town, the Citadel, Septon Maynard's records. She was already thinking about what could be done about records. She left the gallery before anyone below thought to look up, and the door behind her made no sound. The logic was simple enough that Cersei could have drawn it on a page, and she had, in effect, drawn it in her mind while the gallery door was still closing behind her. There were two foundations supporting the claim, and only two. The first was Howland Reed, a minor lord from a castle that moved through a swamp and could not be physically verified, who had a lifelong allegiance to House Stark, who had waited 15 years before producing this account, and who had no independent corroboration beyond his own sealed letter. The second was Ned Stark's word, which in isolation was not nothing. Ned Stark's word was, in certain circles, worth considerable weight, but which, without corroboration, was a man defending his own story. Remove Howland Reed, or sufficiently damage his credibility, and what remained was Ned Stark saying a thing that benefited Ned Stark. That was a much smaller problem. She found Jaime in the early morning, in the room they had been given, before the household was awake. She told him what was needed: someone with standing, someone who could speak to the Kingsguard's records, and the roster of those who had and hadn't been present at the relevant events to formally raise the question of whether Reed's account was the recollection of a witness or the construction of a loyal bannerman. Jaime listened without interrupting. "No," he said. "The matter requires. I won't stand in front of that man and call him a liar." His voice was quiet and very final. "He is not lying. We both know he is not lying. Calling a truthful man a liar in a castle where we are guests is not something I am going to do." He held her gaze. "Not for this." She looked at him. "Then what are you going to do?" "What Robert has already said he intends to do." He moved to the window. "The written records from the citadel. The matter cannot be resolved until the documents have been examined. Robert said as much himself in the hall. Delay is not defeat." He paused, and she could see him choosing how much to say and how much to leave to her. "Delay is only defeat if the records say what Reed says they say. If someone were to ensure the search were inconclusive, then delay becomes something else." She looked at him for a long moment. He was looking out the window and not at her, which was his way of offering her a thing he did not want to be seen offering. "Suggest the delay to Robert," she said. "That is all I'm asking of you." He went. She sat alone and thought about the citadel and about an old man in King's Landing who had served 4 kings and understood very well which direction the wind was currently blowing. Tyrion found Ned in the library after midday. Ned was sitting with a book open in front of him that he was clearly not reading. This was a common enough posture among people who needed a reason to be somewhere quiet, and Tyrion recognized it. He took the chair across the table without being offered it. "My sister is going to try to destroy this," he said. Ned looked at him. "I don't yet know by what method. She is still choosing. But I have spent a sufficient number of years watching Cersei decide on approaches to recognize when she is in the process of deciding." He set his hands flat on the table. "I thought you ought to know that someone in that direction is presently deciding." Ned was quiet for a moment. "Why are you telling me this?" "Because not telling you is distasteful in a way I find I'm not willing to be." He picked up a small carved figure from the table, a chess piece, a knight, turned it over, set it down. "What does the boy intend to do? The one this is about?" "Nothing at present," Ned said. "He was told 5 days ago that his entire life has been a different story than the one he was living. He is 15. That is exactly the correct amount of time to have absorbed that kind of information," Tyrion said, "which is to say, not nearly enough. He should be given considerably more before anyone requires him to be anything other than a confused boy with a significant problem." He paused. "There is another thing. Tell me. If a raven reaches my father before Robert formally acts, before there is anything official and public and on record that cannot simply be set aside, the situation becomes considerably more difficult." He met Ned's eyes. "Tywin Lannister is at Casterly Rock. He is not here, but he has ravens, and he has people who send him information, and he will have information about what happened in this hall yesterday before the week is out. Whatever Robert is going to do, he would do well to do it while my father is still only listening rather than responding." Ned was quiet for a long moment. "Thank you," he said. "I am merely the embarrassing Lannister who talks too much and cannot be expected to hold anything back," Tyrion said. "It would be very difficult for anyone to prove I warned you of anything." He stood. "Good afternoon, Lord Stark." He left before Ned could say more. It was his preferred method of exit. The raven went out from the Winterfell rookery before supper. Robert had drafted the instruction himself, a request to the citadel at Old Town to locate the personal records of Septon Maynard pertaining to ceremonies performed in the final years of the Targaryen dynasty. The Raven would fly south to King's Landing, where Grand Maester Pycelle, 82 years old and 4 kings deep into his tenure, managed royal correspondence in the king's absence. He would receive the king's instruction, understand its implications, and forward the appropriate inquiry to Old Town. A Raven between King's Landing and Old Town would take another 3 days, or 4, depending on the wind. Cersei had already sent her own letter south by road. It would arrive more slowly. That was fine. She was not asking for speed. She was asking for a particular kind of care. In the afternoon, Cersei moved through the halls with the unhurried ease of a woman who had nothing on her mind. She found herself in conversation over the midday meal with 2 of the older northern lords who had been present in the hall. She was warm and gracious and entirely at ease, and she expressed admiration for Ned Stark in terms so sincere that they could not be called anything other than admiration. She said she admired him enormously. She said she found the whole situation. She paused, searching pleasantly for the right word. Curious. She found it curious that Lord Reed had appeared precisely when he had, before the royal progress arrived, at exactly the moment Ned was about to be named hand and leave Winterfell. Just as the boy's future was being settled, she said she wondered if anyone else found the timing worth considering. She asked. She did not state. She left the question in the room and moved on, smiling, and let it do what questions do when planted in soil that has been properly prepared. She was gracious throughout. Her face was entirely warm. Nothing that could be quoted or repeated back to her had been said. Robb found John in the yard when the torches had been lit. He had been there a while, working a whetstone along a blade with the specific focus of someone who needed his hands occupied and his mind elsewhere, but was not managing to get his mind elsewhere. Robb sat down beside him on the mounting block without asking, put his elbows on his knees, and said nothing. After a long time, he said, "You're still my brother." John kept his eyes on the blade. "I know. You're Lyanna's son. Father says you look like her." A pause. Apparently. That's what he said. Another silence. The whetstone moved. "Does this mean I outrank you?" Robb said. "Or you outrank me?" John almost laughed. It was a small sound, not quite complete. A single fault line opening in stonework that had been solid for 5 days. But it was there, and Robb marked it. "I genuinely have no idea," John said. "I think it's going to be complicated. I think everything is going to be complicated." Robb accepted this. They sat together in the yard, in the cold, with the narrow torchlight and the sound of the castle settling around them, and for the first time in 5 days, John was sitting somewhere that felt approximately like solid ground. Not because anything had been resolved, because Robb was there, which was a thing that did not require resolution. He put the whetstone down and looked at the dark sky. "Tell me something normal," he said. "Bran fell off the roof of the Lesser Keep this morning," Robb said. "He's fine. He says he was climbing it, but he clearly was not expecting to fall. Is that normal? For Bran, it's extremely normal." John was quiet for a moment. Then he said, "Good." And he meant it. The king sent for him mid-morning, without ceremony, a brief word through the door. No explanation. "Come to the Solar now." John followed the messenger through the passages and stood for a moment outside the door, thinking about the man on the other side of it. The king. The man who had built the present order on a war and a warhammer. The man who had been standing at the trident when Rhaegar died. He did not let himself stand there long. He knocked, heard Robert say to come in, and went in. The Solar was small enough to feel private and large enough to feel formal, which was the particular combination that made a room feel like it had been chosen deliberately. A fire, a table, 2 chairs, a window showing the grey northern sky. Robert sat in one of the chairs without a cup of wine, which John noticed. It meant something. A morning meeting without wine. It meant Robert wanted to be in full possession of whatever this was. He indicated the other chair. John sat. Robert looked at him. He looked for a long time, in the measuring way he had been looking at John since the day of his arrival. But in here, alone, without the household around them, without the pretense that it was about anything other than what it was about. "You look like a Stark," he said. "I know," John said. She had that same way of looking at a man. Robert said it to the fire more than to John, like she was deciding whether he deserved the air he was breathing, like the decision wasn't final, but she was working on it. He stopped. She never did anything in halves. That was always the thing about her. John held himself still and said nothing. He did not know what to say to this man. He was not sure, sitting here in this chair, in this room, what he was supposed to feel about someone who had been Lyanna's betrothed, and who had killed Rhaegar at a river ford, and who was now looking at Jon's face the way you look at a face, for something you used to know. Robert began to talk, mostly to the fire, or to some intermediate distance between Jon and the wall, the manner of a man who has held a thing alone for a long time, and has, without quite deciding, put it down. He talked about the Harrenhal tourney. He had been young then, strong in the particular way of someone who has not yet spent the strength on anything that has required it. He was going to marry Lyanna. He had been certain of this with the absolute certainty of someone who expects the world to cooperate with his picture of it. She was Ned's sister. She was fierce, and nothing like what people said girls were supposed to be, and she had looked at him like she was always deciding something, and she had laughed at him once, at something he said, a real laugh, unguarded, the kind that didn't arrange its face for the audience, the kind that meant the person actually found the thing funny. "I have thought about that laugh more times than I can count," Robert said, "in the years since. In all of them." He paused. I expected to stop thinking about it. I never did. He was quiet for a moment. "Rhaegar crowned her that day," he said. "Rode past his wife with the whole realm watching and set winter roses in Lyanna's lap." Something moved in his voice. Not the raw anger Jon might have expected, but something older, the settled scar of a wound that had long since finished being fresh. "I went to war on the premise that he had taken her, that he had stolen something that was mine." He looked at the table. "Ned tells me it was more complicated than that." The fire moved. Outside the window, a cloud took some of the light. "What do you want?" Robert said. Jon looked at him. "I don't know yet." "That's not evasion." "No, I mean it plainly." Jon kept his hands still on his knees. "I've been called Jon Snow for 15 years. I haven't learned how to be called anything else yet. I don't know what the name I apparently have requires of me, or what I want it to mean, or whether I want it to mean anything at all." He paused. "I don't know yet." Robert looked at him for a moment. "That is the most honest thing anyone has said to me in 20 years, he said. It was not quite a smile. It was in the country that smiles come from. The fire popped. Robert refilled his cup, thought better of it, set it down. "Do you know what your father did?" he said. He did not mean Ned. Jon understood. "He loved my mother," he said. Robert was quiet. He accepted this. "Then, he loved my betrothed. He married her. He gave her a child." His voice was level. Not the eruption Jon had expected. Not the war voice from the songs. but something quieter and less presentable than anger. The voice of a man stating facts that have been stated to himself many times. Then he rode to the trident and I killed him. He stopped. I don't regret the blow. I have never for a single day regretted the blow. He was quiet for a long time. I regret what came after, he said. In King's Landing. What was done in the city when it fell. I regret that I did not stop it. He looked at the window rather than at John. I put a man on a throne who let it happen. That is also something I regret. He did not say the names. He did not need to. John knew what children had died in the sack, what they were called, how old they had been. He sat with the weight of what Robert was not quite saying and did not fill the silence. Robert turned back from the window. I don't know what to do with you, he said. He said it without cruelty, plainly, the way an honest man states an honest problem. I don't know how to give a Targaryen heir what he's owed without pulling down what 15 years of work has built. The lords who fought in the war would not receive a Targaryen prince with open arms. Half of them would see a claim to a throne they helped build from the ruins of the last dynasty. He looked at John directly. I am telling you this so that you understand the shape of the problem, not because I've given up on it. John said nothing. But there is one thing I know, Robert said. He held John's eyes with the same directness John had come to recognize as the most honest version of this man, the one that existed before the drink and the loudness and the decades of wearing a crown he had never particularly wanted. You will not die for being born. Whatever I decide about succession, about what this means for the realm, you will not be killed for existing. That I swear to you. He held the eye contact. On her memory. That I swear. John nodded once. Not the nod of agreement or gratitude, the nod of a man receiving something and taking its weight, and not yet knowing what to do with the weight. Neither of them spoke of love. It was too large a word for a room this size, and too complicated for two people who had arrived at each other from opposite sides of a war. John left. He walked the passages back to the yard with his hands at his sides, and his face still and everything he had just heard held close, and he stood in the cold outside air for a long time before he went back inside. Outside the solar door, a woman had been attending to something near the wainscoting. She had stood there through most of the conversation, moving quietly, heard most of what passed through the old wood. The phrase she had been listening for, the specific phrase she had been asked to report, she had heard clearly. You will not die for being born. She went to find the queen. Cersei received the report standing in her chambers and said nothing for a long time after the woman finished speaking. Robert had made his decision. Not formally, not publicly, not on any record that could be examined or contested, but in the way that mattered with Robert, the man who swore things aloud on the dead woman's memory, looking the boy in the face. It was done. Whatever the Citadel's records said or did not say, Robert had already determined what he believed, and believing it had led him to swear it, and sworn oaths were not things that Robert Baratheon set aside when they became inconvenient. The records from Old Town had to be managed before they arrived, and made this permanent. She sent the laundress away, and stood alone in her room, and thought about letters and about old men who understood the direction of the wind. The letter took her the better part of an hour to write, which was unusual. Cersei Lannister did not ordinarily struggle with words. The difficulty was in saying it in a way that could not be traced back to her if the letter went wrong, if the old septon at the Citadel was less tractable than she hoped, or if someone opened the wrong seal, or if the recipient was the kind of man who kept things. There were always men who kept things. She wrote it 3 times. The first two went into the fire. The third was stripped of every identifying word she could find, until it read like a request from no one in particular to someone equally anonymous, and the only thing that made it legible as a letter at all was the amount of gold she was having sewn into the courier's belt. The man she had chosen was not Lannister-liveried. He was one of 3 servants she maintained separately, men whose wages came from her own accounts and not the Crown's, men who had proven themselves useful in the past, and who understood that their continued employment depended on a particular quality of silence. She did not know his name in any complete sense. She did not need to. She met him in the passage behind the eastern stables, in the dark before dawn, while Robert was still snoring in the chambers above the great hall and the household was deep in its last hour of sleep. She gave him the letter and 2 instructions. Get to Old Town before any message from Winterfell could arrive by Raven. Find the man now sitting in Septon Maynard's old chair, whichever old man that was, and make him understand the price of being helpful. The man nodded and left, and Cersei walked back through the dark passages to her rooms, and she felt better. The letter from Howland Reed was one problem. Reed himself was another. But those were problems in the middle of a castle full of witnesses, problems that required discretion and patience. The Old Town records were a problem she could solve from here, tonight, with a letter and a fast horse. She sat at the window in her room for a while after, watching the sky turn from black to grey to the particular cold white of a northern dawn. She was not tired. She rarely slept well this far north. There was something in the air at Winterfell that refused to let her relax, something old and watchful in the stones, and she knew this was not a rational thing to feel, but she felt it regardless. What she had heard from the gallery was still sitting in her. The words were not the problem. She had expected something like them from the moment she had seen Howland Reed's face at the feast and assembled what she knew about Lyanna Stark and what Robert had whispered in the early years of their marriage when the wine was in him. She had been building that particular architecture in her mind for years. What she had not expected was Robert's tone. She had expected fury. She had expected the kind of denial that precedes eventual acceptance, the version of Robert who needed several days and several skins of wine before he could look at an unwelcome truth without flinching. She had not expected the particular quality she had heard in the king's voice, the sound of a man who had arrived somewhere he had been travelling toward for a long time without knowing it, and who found it less terrible than he had feared. That was the thing that sat in her like a splinter. There was a version of Robert she knew how to manage, the version who raged and broke things and eventually fell into her hands for comfort, the version who could not see what he did not want to see. This other version, the one who had sat with Ned Stark and spoken plainly about a dead woman and her living son, she did not know this version as well. She was not certain it was manageable. Robert was in the Godswood when she finally rose and dressed. She knew because she made it her business to know where Robert was, not from affection, but for the same reason a chess player watches the other side of the board. He had been there since before the dawn watch, which meant he had not slept, which meant he was in the state she liked least, the state where the grief and the old guilt settled into something that looked, from the outside, like clarity. She didn't go to him. There was nothing useful she could do in the Godswood. Instead, she went to the gallery above the east yard. Not the one she had used before. That scene was over. This smaller one looked down on the practice ground and the stable yard. She watched the yard come to life. Grooms, servants, a boy carrying a bucket. Then Robb Stark and Jon Snow neither apparently aware that everything had changed, working through their morning forms with the wooden practice swords. She watched Jon. He was good. She had noticed that at the feast and noticed it again now. The easy economy of his movement, the way he never overextended. Dark hair and grey eyes, like the Starks. Nothing visible in him that announced what he was. His fighting style differed from Robb's, tidier, less aggressive, more patient. He waited for openings rather than forcing them. The boy moved like someone who had learned that patience was a weapon. She would have to think carefully about what to do with that. Meanwhile, in the solar that Ned Stark kept for matters of the north, the Lord of Winterfell was sitting across from his king, and both of them were drinking wine they did not particularly want, because the hour was wrong for it, and neither of them took pleasure in drinking at that hour. But there was something in the conversation they were having that required at least the appearance of something in the cup. Robert said he had been in the Godswood since before dawn. Ned said he knew. There was a pause. Outside, the castle was waking up. The yard, the kitchens, the sound of children somewhere above. "I want to know what you want," Robert said finally. Ned looked at him across the table. "I want my son to be safe." "He is your son," Robert said. It was not a question. "He is my son," Ned said. Robert turned his cup in his hands. He did not drink from it. "Lyanna asked you to protect him. When she was dying, she made you promise." It was the first time either of them had said it plainly in a room together, without the darkness or the Godswood or the weight of the carved face to absorb it. In the daylight of the solar, the words were different, more final. "She did," Ned said. Robert was quiet for a long time. Ned did not fill the silence. "I need you to understand something," Robert said at last. "I have been carrying the thing I did, the thing I let happen, because I was too angry to stop it and too proud to apologize afterward. I have been carrying that since the tower. I do not know what she asked you when she was dying, but I know what she would have asked me if I had been the one in that room, and it would not have been to make him a king." Ned waited. "She would have asked me to leave him alone," Robert said, "to let him be a boy, to not turn him into a reason for a war." The fire in the solar crackled. Outside, someone was leading horses across the frozen yard. The sound of the hooves came through the window, regular and unhurried. "Then what do you want?" Ned said. Robert looked up. "I want to tell you that I know. I want you to know that I know. I want the boy to know, when he is ready, that the king who sat the throne his father lost, that man knew and looked at him and chose to let him live his life. That is what I want, for that to be the true story, and not the other one. Not the one where nobody ever told the truth and it came out wrong later." Ned was quiet for a moment. "He already knows," he said. Robert looked up. Something moved through his face that was hard to name. "When did you tell him?" 2 days ago, in the Godswood." Robert was still. Then he let out a breath, something long and complicated, and picked up his cup and finally drank from it and set it down. How did he take it? Ned thought about the Godswood, about Jon's face in the dark, about the particular quality of stillness that had come over the boy when the words finally arrived. He thought about what it had cost him to stand there and say those words to that face. He took it the way Lyanna would have taken it, Ned said, with too much grace and not enough visible grief. Robert looked at him for a moment. Then he laughed, the short, sharp kind, the kind that is not quite amusement, but is not quite grief either. "That sounds right," he said. They sat together in the solar for a while after that. The king and the lord, the wine between them, the fire making its steady sound, and neither of them spoke for a long time. And it was the closest thing to an honest silence that the two of them had shared in 15 years. Howland Reed noticed the man leaving. He was not, by nature, a man who watched exits. He watched things that moved through the middle of a room, the people who stayed, the people who lingered, the people whose presence in a particular place at a particular hour said something about what they wanted. Exits were someone else's business. But this man caught his eye because he was leaving wrong. He was leaving the way people leave when they do not want to be noticed, which is a different quality of departure from simply going about one's business. The man was in the stable yard. He was having his horse saddled by a groom who was working quickly, the way grooms work when they have been given money to hurry. The horse was not Lannister liveried. The man was not in livery at all. He wore travelling clothes chosen to make him nothing in particular. Grey wool, good boots, the dark cloak that was suitable for any season and any house. He had a saddlebag and a sword, and the face of someone who had been told to be somewhere before someone else arrived. Howland watched him from the window of his room above the east passage. He thought about what he had come to Winterfell to do, and what had happened since, and the pieces still unresolved. He thought about the gallery above the hall the night of the king's arrival, the figure he had glimpsed withdrawing from it. He had no way of knowing who it had been, but he had spent 20 years in the Neck, which rewarded thinking sideways about things, and he had a quality of attention that assembled pictures from the pieces other people did not think to watch. He went to find Ned. He found him in the passage outside the solar, still carrying the particular expression of a man who has said a difficult true thing out loud and found the world did not end because of it. "There is a man leaving," Howland said. He said it quietly, because there were servants at the far end of the corridor. Ned looked at him. He has no livery. He has been paid to move quickly. He is going south. Ned's expression did not change in the obvious way, but something shifted behind it. He understood. They had known each other for 20 years, and for men who had spent 20 years understanding each other through silences, the conversation did not require more. "When?" Ned said. "He is saddling now." Ned thought for a moment. "Let him go." Howland looked at him. "She is not wrong to try," Ned said. He said it with the particular flatness of a man stating a fact he finds unpleasant, but true. She will do whatever she can to protect her children. That is what a mother does. The records in Old Town, if they reach them first, that is what it is. We have the letter. We have you. Those things cannot be taken back." "She knows that," Howland said. "Yes, she knows that. So the letter to Old Town is not about destroying the evidence. It is about reducing it, making it one man's word instead of two sources." Ned paused. "She is trying to make the truth manageable. She may succeed at that part of it." Howland was quiet for a moment. He watched the passage, the servants moving at the far end, the ordinary business of a castle that did not know what its walls were containing. "You are not going to stop her. I am going to let her do what she can do from here," Ned said. "And I am going to let the truth do what it can do from here. Those two things will find their level. They usually do." Howland had known Ned Stark for 20 years and had never fully decided whether his approach to impossible situations was wisdom or stubbornness. He had concluded over the years that it was probably both, and that distinguishing between them was not useful. "What did Robert say?" he asked. Ned looked toward the window at the end of the passage, the cold grey light coming through it. "He said he wants the true story to exist. He said he wants Jon to know, when he is older, that the king who sat the throne his father lost looked at him and chose to let him live his life. Howland was still. That is a kind thing. Robert is a kinder man than people give him credit for, Ned said. He is also a less careful one. But today, he was more of the first. They stood in the passage for a moment. Below, the faint sounds of the yard carried up. "What happens now?" Howland said. "Now the party packs up," Ned said. "Now they ride south and we go back to being the north. John knows what he is. Robert knows what John is. The truth is out of the ground and standing in the air. What anyone does with it next is the part I cannot control." Howland thought about the letter he had carried for 15 years, about the road south from the Tower of Joy, about the infant wrapped in Lyanna's cloak, and the question that had sat underneath all of it. What is the truth worth if no one acts on it? "He is a good boy," Howland said finally. "He is," Ned said. "Rhaegar would have wanted to know him." There was a long silence. Ned said nothing, because there was nothing to say to that which would not be either a lie or a wound. Meanwhile, in the room, the Lannister party had been given at the end of the guest corridor. Cersei sat before a cold hearth and thought about what she had overheard. She had not intended to overhear anything. She had gone to the solar passage to send a servant with a message for Jaime, and she had heard voices through the door, and the quality of those voices had stopped her feet without her intending it. She had stood in the passage and heard Ned Stark say, plainly in the daylight, "He took it the way Lyanna would have taken it." And then she had heard Robert laugh. She had left before the laughter finished. She sat now and thought about what that laughter meant. She had known Robert Baratheon for 15 years, and she knew the difference between the laughter that meant nothing and the laughter that meant something had released in a man at the end of a long grief. She was not a fool. She was not going to pretend she did not understand what she had heard. Robert had decided. He had not told her. He had not asked her. He had gone to the Godswood alone in the dark and come back, having made a decision about the shape of the world. And she would find out what that decision was eventually, because he would tell her, or because it would become visible in the way he treated the boy. And either way, she would have to work with it. She thought about Joffrey. She thought about the Iron Throne and the crown, and the long line stretching from Robert through Joffrey into the future she had spent years constructing. She thought about what a living Targaryen heir meant for that line, even an unacknowledged one, even one with a bastard's name living quietly in a northern castle. A threat that is not acted upon is still a threat. The letter was already gone. The courier was on the road south. That part was done. She thought, there is still time. Not today, and not this season. But time was not a fixed thing. She had learned that. You could spend years building the conditions for a single hour, and the hour, when it arrived, did what you had built it to do. Then the door opened without a knock and Jaime came in, the way Jaime always came in, and sat on the edge of the table and looked at her with the expression he wore when he was about to say something she already knew but did not want to hear confirmed. "He is going to let the boy live," Jaime said. "I know. He is going to ride back to King's Landing and do nothing." "I know that too." Jaime was quiet. He watched her the way he always watched her. The same green eyes, the same face, but more open, less guarded. He had never learned to want things quietly. "Cersei," he said. "I know," she said, before he could finish. She said it the way she said most things to Jaime when they were alone, as a complete sentence that contained its own argument and did not require his opinion. Jaime was quiet. She looked at the cold hearth. Outside the window, The yard was already louder than it had been an hour ago. More voices, the sounds of horses being moved, the specific percussion of a large party beginning the slow process of assembling itself for departure. Winterfell was already starting to return to itself, preparing for the moment when the southern noise packed up and rode away and left the stones to their own cold business. "We leave tomorrow morning," Jaime said. "Yes," Cersei said. She looked at the hearth for a moment longer. She thought about the boy in the yard below, with his dark hair and his grey eyes, and his patience, the particular kind of patience that belonged to someone who had learned to wait for things to come to him. She stored it in the same place she stored all the things she was not yet done with. The place that had been filling up for years. The place that had room for a great deal more. She would come back to it. She always came back to things. Howland Reed came to find him early, before the yard was fully awake. Jon was in the stable, not because anyone had asked him to be there, but because it was the kind of work that made sense to his hands when his head was too full for sitting. He had been that way for 3 days, moving from task to task, keeping his hands occupied, letting the larger part of it settle at whatever pace it chose. The Crannog man appeared in the doorway the way he appeared everywhere, without announcing himself, without making the space aware of him until he was already in it. He stopped at the end of the stall and looked at Jon for a moment. "I knew your mother," Howland said. "Not well, but well enough." Jon did not stop what he was doing. "What was she like?" Howland thought about it in the way he thought about most things, which was to give the question the weight it deserved before answering. "Stubborn," he said. "Impatient with people who said things they did not mean. Very good with a horse." He paused. She laughed in a way that made everyone in the room look at her. "Your father was the same way. Not about horses." But the laughing? Jon set down the brush he had been using. He thought about the gods would, about Ned's voice in the dark, about the name that was not his name, and the story that was not the story he had grown up inside. He thought about a woman he had never met, who had made a choice that had made him. "She chose it," Jon said. It was not quite a question. "She chose it," Howland said. "She was 22 years old, and she was the most willful person I have ever known, and she chose it with both hands. There was nothing helpless about any of it." Something shifted in Jon at that. Not relief and not grief, but something that lived between the two and had been waiting for those particular words. "Why did you come?" Jon said. "After 15 years. "Because 15 years is long enough," Howland said. "Because she asked me not to forget, and forgetting and waiting can look alike from the outside, and I wanted to be certain I knew the difference." He paused, "And I wanted to see what you had become." "What have I become?" Howland Reed looked at him for a long moment with those pale eyes, the eyes of a man who had spent 20 years reading things that moved beneath the surface of still water. "Something worth coming for," he said. He left before Jon could answer, which Jon suspected was deliberate. Jon stayed in the stable for a while after. He thought about what that meant, and what it did not mean, and the difference between the two. He thought about the wall, the way he had thought about it for years, the clean, dark certainty of it, the life that was at least honestly what it looked like. He was not sure yet whether it looked the same to him as it had 3 days ago. He thought it probably did not. He was not yet sure what it looked like now. The royal party assembled in the yard mid-morning. The departure had the specific quality of a large thing set in motion, the irreversibility of it, the way several hundred people and their horses and their carts and their noise moved together in one direction and could not be called back. Banners were folded and strapped to saddle rolls. Horses were brought out in long strings. The Lannister men made their accustomed noise, which was louder than necessary and more organized than it looked. Jon stood with Robb near the gatehouse and watched it all come together. "One of them tried to buy Dancer yesterday," Robb said. "One of the Lannister knights. Offered good money." "What did you say?" "I said she was not for sale. He seemed to think that was negotiable." Robb watched a Lannister groom narrowly avoid dropping a trunk. It was not negotiable. Jon laughed and meant it. Robb was Robb, and the ordinary business of standing next to him was its own kind of comfort, the specific comfort of things that had not changed and were not going to change. Cersei Lannister rode past them on her way to the column, her back straight and her face arranged the way it was always arranged when she was thinking about something she was not done with. She did not look at Jon. She had not looked at him directly since the morning after the feast, and the not looking was itself a kind of attention. Jon filed it away without quite knowing why. Robert came through the yard last, on the large horse that had borne his bulk through the gates a week ago. He was looking at the road ahead, at the gate, and the country beyond it. The way a man looks at a place he is leaving with something unfinished behind him. Then his eyes found Jon. He stopped his horse. He looked at Jon for a moment. The grey eyes, the dark hair, the boy who was 15 years old and did not yet know what he was going to do with everything he had been given. Robert held that look for the count of 3. Then he gave a single, deliberate nod, the kind that carries more weight than most words. Jon nodded back. Robert rode on through the gate, and the column moved with him, and that was all that passed between them in front of anyone who might be watching, which was, Jon understood, exactly the point. Ned found him when the last of the horses had cleared the gate, and the yard was returning to its ordinary size. He came to stand beside Jon, and they both looked at the road for a moment, the empty road where the column had been, the dust already settling back into the frozen air. "He nodded at you," Ned said. "Yes." "That is how Robert Baratheon keeps a promise," Ned said quietly. "It does not always look like much from the outside." They walked to the Godswood together, not by decision, but because it was where their feet went, when the thing that needed saying was too large for a corridor. The heart tree was there as it always was. The white bark and the red leaves and the carved face watching everything, with the patience of something that had been watching since before any of this began. Jon sat at the edge of the pool. Ned sat beside him. "What happens now?" Jon said. "Now you are still Jon Snow," Ned said, "and I am still your father, and winter is still coming, and the grain stores still want checking, and Robb still needs someone to beat him at swords often enough to keep him honest." He paused. "The rest of it, the part with the other name in it, that part will be there when you are ready. It does not expire." Jon looked at the water. A leaf moved across the surface of the pool, slow and unhurried. "She loved him," Jon said. "My mother. Whatever else is true, she loved him, and she chose it." "She did," Ned said. "The choosing was hers. No one took that from her." Jon thought about 15 years of a kept silence, about what it had cost Ned to hold it, and what it had cost him to break it, about the particular kind of love that looks like lying from the outside and is not lying at all. "Thank you," Jon said, "for the keeping of it, and for the telling of it." Ned said nothing for a long moment. He put his hand briefly on Jon's shoulder, the hand of a man who had carried this for 15 years, and set it down in a Godswood in the dark, and was still here, on the other side of it. Then he took it away. They sat in the Godswood, until the cold became something more than background, and then they rose and walked back through the gate into the yard. Winterfell was going about its business the way Winterfell always went about its business. The horses and the forges and the distant voices, the smell of bread from the kitchens, Bran shouting something incomprehensible from the direction of the lesser keep. All of it exactly as it had been the morning Howland Reed rode through the gates. All of it exactly the same. Robb met them at the gate with a question about a merchant from White Harbour who had arrived while everyone was distracted by the royal party, and Ned went with him to deal with it, and Jon was left standing in the yard with the winter air on his face and the truth inside him and the whole long road of it ahead. He did not know yet what he was going to do. He thought this was probably the right condition to be in. The ones who knew too early usually knew the wrong thing. He was Jon Snow. He was 15 years old. He was still this. That was our theory. Westeros is a land filled with exciting stories and possibilities, and we love exploring them. If you want to accompany us on this journey across the 7 kingdoms and beyond, then please like, share,